Let's talk a little bit about how to facilitate productive family meetings, whether they're business meetings or family council, more emotional stuff. And the reason I want to frame it that way is often when we think about it's either a family question or a business question. And I think that's a silly challenge because things are rarely as simple. They need to be combined and they need to be embraced in both ways. So, one idea is to think about structures. In other words, what's the way in which you want to have various meetings? A common example would be to create some guidelines. For instance, we're going to be on time, we're going to be respectful, we're going to listen to one another, we're not going to cut one another off, and we're going to stay attentive to some kind of an agenda that might evolve. A related guideline that I think is really important is to make sure it's facilitated. I don't mean necessarily by an expensive business psychologist like me. I could be an elder. It could be someone in your church or your neighborhood or your community, somebody that you like and trust. And it could be somebody who's in their 20s or in their 60s or 70s. It really doesn't matter. But the fact is, we all behave better on Saturday night at dinner when we invite somebody for dinner. When you've got somebody to facilitate the meeting, things tend to go better. People are better behaved and they're able to attend to whatever the agenda might be, which means you're going to be more successful. It's going to accelerate some kind of a change. So I want to describe three kinds of changes that I've observed, and it might be intuitive. One is when the elders change. The second is when the next gens or the younger folks change. And the third is when everybody changes. So let me address them. Elders only change when they trust that their loved ones are not going to lose the assets. Boom. That's the bottom line. The primary motivation of all human behavior is that fear of losing assets. We're averse to losing any assets. Ask anybody who's built a company. The founders are immensely protective, thankfully, and they're immensely narcissistic, thankfully. If they weren't, they wouldn't have done the job, built the assets, and chosen to have the family meeting in the first place. So often, elders need a voice. They need a time to express whatever is important, and they need validation. So it could be that that happens in one-to-one or smaller meetings or with dyads and triads and smaller groups. Or it could mean that it happens when everybody's gathered together in the room. And that's a beautiful thing. Elders often think of this as their most important legacy. It's sometimes money, but it's most often reputational legacy. So those are some general examples of how elders might change. Behaviorally, elders might speak less. They might cut people off less. They might publicly thank or acknowledge with kindness those who have done whatever they've done. And they might state their hope and optimism because when they do, people tend to participate a little bit more fully, which leads to the next gens, the younger folks in the room. Commonly, there's a bloodline or pattern of some sort, but there's also some married in pattern. In other words, the folks who are now part of the system, but don't really know their role. And sometimes that's worth clarifying. That group of people has immense wisdom, better educated typically. They're going to live longer typically. They're healthier typically. They've got more career choices and capacity and aptitude. They're more digitally trusting than the elders, all of which means they've got agency. They've got choice. So the number one thing behaviorally that I look for is opportunities for the next gens to express their thoughts and feelings on important topics. That's called agency in psychology. And in my research, that's the number one behavior for individuals. When they're able to express their thoughts and feelings on important topics, all kinds of beautiful things happen, including the chance for public optimism, which is the second most important behavior we identified in our research. If the next gens are able to be optimistic, everybody in the room is able to support that optimism. We all want to believe that the younger or next gens or the successors are eminently capable, but that can be delusional. So we have to also assume that they're optimistic about the business or the future or the family or the goals, whatever those values might be. So what I'm leading to is the third type of family meeting. The first is when the elders change. The second is when the next gens change. The third is when everybody changes. And this is not a random event. This is a progression that happens over years sometimes. It's naive to think that you can hire somebody who's going to facilitate a meeting and all your decades of behavioral reinforced patterns are going to disappear like rainwater into the soil. That's just silly. But everybody can change. And I'm going to give you a little rubric that is ancient and useful sometimes because I think a little structure goes a long way. And it's rhyming, so it's easy for you to write down or think about. I think in family meetings, we need to provide the space and the pace and the grace. So what do I mean? Space is the frequency. I'm sorry, space is the event. It's the notion that we're going to get together and it's sacred. in most families. It could be Sunday dinners, it could be quarterly events, it could be annual retreats, it could be a physical space like a lake house or mountain house or a car ride. It doesn't really matter what the space is as long as those who need to be in the conversation are in the conversation. The pace is the frequency of those meetings. It's a bit like a heartbeat that shares or shows that we share about those we love and care about. And the pace could be infrequent, but it's better if it's regular because then it's predictable. If we know we've got an event coming up every week or month or quarter, it's a comforting thing not to defer topics, but to say, my family loves me and we're going to get together quarterly and we're going to have this event facilitated by whomever. Why? So that we can practice grace, not in a religious sense, not in a to trivialize the Catholic Church. A communion wafer does really not absolve everybody's sins in a family business because we're so emotionally complex. So grace to me and to most psychologists means accepting the inconsistent behavior of others. Now, that's a behavioral definition. It implies that I don't need to like it, I don't need to agree, but I can accept it when somebody in the family does whatever. Those are just some general thoughts for everybody changing their behavior. Often people will ask, what happens if you don't do any of this? What happens if you don't have family meetings? And the short answer is true in physics, is true in all material things, and that's entropy. Chaos. If, in fact, we ignore a medical diagnosis, then we're going to die sooner or of something that could have been prevented, right? That analogy works with families. And I guess I should add a few examples. I think it's a great investment in time and energy for anybody to facilitate this process and for someone to stand up and say, I don't want to be in the business. Because if the patriarchs think that the next gen or G2 or G3 or G4 wants to be or deserves to be and ought to be part of the family in that manner, and that person doesn't want to, what better investment could there be for the family meeting but to say, I don't want to be part of it? We don't quit early enough in our careers. But as we live longer, and the psychology is research is really clear, we ought to quit things faster and sooner. Not forever. It could be that people leave the business for a period of time and then come back. That's quite common. And in fact, if the door is open and people are encouraged to come back, it's really useful. So I invite people to think about avoiding the entropy. An image that I sometimes bring when I walk into those rooms is, well, two images. One is that we are emotionally complex. We're blobs. We're emotionally complex blobs. And how we choose to interact with one another is never planned out. If somebody triggers some amygdala hijack or emotional response or says something the way they did 20 years ago about your children, you're not going to forget that stuff. And it will cause you to behave in a certain way, or at least have the impulse to behave in that way, right? So the second image that I often bring is from my youth. I played hockey in college and I reffed a lot of hockey games. And I think without cheapening the image here, it's a useful transferable skill. Not because I've got a striped shirt and I'm going into a family meeting, but because there are times to make a call. In football, you throw the red flag on the coach will throw the red flag when he's or she has a call on the field. Same with a family. It's a complex emotional blob of a system. And sometimes the outcomes and discern whatever is appropriate behavior and what's not appropriate. So those are the two images I often bring: emotional blobs and gentle referees who make the call.